The Arizona sun came up mean and indifferent over Highway 89 the way it always did in late July, like it had somewhere more important to be and resented every mile it had to cross to get there. The light hit the asphalt at a low angle and turned the road ahead into something liquid, something unstable, a mirage of water on bone-dry ground. Clara Whitmore had driven this stretch of highway more times than she could count. She knew every curve, every mile marker, every place where the guardrail had been dented by someone who took a turn too fast or fell asleep at the wheel. She knew this road the way you know the face of someone you have lived beside for decades. Not because you studied it, but because it was simply always there. She was driving her 1987 Ford Bronco, the same truck Henry had bought the year they moved to Sedona. It had 214,000 miles on it. The air conditioning worked on good days and gave up on bad ones. Today it was working, which Clara took as a modest blessing. The radio was tuned to a country station out of Flagstaff, and Willie Nelson was singing about being on the road again, and Clara reached out to turn it off, then stopped herself. Let it play. There was no particular reason to have silence, and there was no particular reason to fill it. Either way, it was just her and the road, and the hard blue sky above the San Francisco peaks. She had come from Dr. Ellison's office in Flagstaff, her second appointment this month. Dr. Ellison was a careful man, a thorough man, the kind of doctor who chose his words the way a surgeon chose instruments precisely and with awareness of the damage they could do. He had sat across from her in his clean office with his clean hands folded on his clean desk, and he had looked at her the way doctors look at patients when the news requires a certain gentleness. He had said her heart was weakening. He had said the structural changes were consistent with what he called significant cardiac fatigue. He had said words like reduced ejection, fraction, and compensatory mechanisms. And then at the end, when all the clinical language had been laid out like tools on a tray, he had said the thing they always said. Mrs. Whitmore, you need to slow down. Reduce stress. Take it easy. Take it easy. Clara had nodded and thanked him and walked out to the parking lot and sat in the Bronco for 3 full minutes before starting the engine. Not because she was frightened. She had lived long enough that the idea of her own death had lost most of its power to frighten her. She sat there because she was trying to locate somewhere inside herself a reason to follow his advice, a reason to protect this particular life, to tend to it carefully, to treat it as something worth preserving. She was still looking for that reason when she pulled out of the parking lot and headed south on Highway 89 toward home. The ranch was 31 miles south of Flagstaff, set back from the road on a dirt track that wound through scrub oak and juniper before opening up into a dry meadow where Henry had built a house in 1991. They had bought the land with every dollar they had saved during 15 years of Clara's Navy service and 10 years of Henry's work at the shipyard in Norfolk. They had driven out from Virginia in the summer of 1990 with everything they owned loaded in the back of a rented truck, and when Henry had first seen the land, when he had stood in that dry meadow with the red rocks of Sedona visible in the distance and the smell of desert sage in the air, he had put his arm around Clara's shoulders and said, "This is where we were always going to end up." Like it had been decided long before either of them had any say in the matter. Henry had been gone for 6 years. A welding accident at the shipyard where he had been doing consulting work after retirement. A faulty oxygen line. They told her it was quick. They told her he had not suffered. Clara believed them because the alternative, imagining him suffering, was not something she was willing to carry. For 6 years, she had woken up every morning in the house they had built together and made coffee in the kitchen, where his coffee cup still sat in the cabinet next to hers, and looked out the window at the dry meadow and the distant red rocks and asked herself the same question she was asking herself this morning. What exactly is the point of any of this? She had been a Navy nurse for 15 years. She had served aboard hospital ships during the final decade of the Cold War. She had worked in trauma bays, in surgical wards, and recovery rooms, had kept her hands steady under conditions that would have broken someone less disciplined, had watched men survive wounds that should have killed them, and watched others die from injuries that seemed survivable, and had understood early that medicine was only partly science. The rest of it was will the patient's will to live and the nurse's refusal to stop fighting on their behalf. After the Navy, she had spent 30 years taking care of Henry. Not because he needed nursing, he was a healthy man for most of those years, strong and careful in the way that men who work with their hands tend to be, but because that was what love looked like in practice. You showed up, you paid attention, you stayed. And then he was gone, and she was 73 years old, and her heart was failing in ways that were medically precise and emotionally appropriate. And she was driving home on Highway 89 with the radio playing and no one waiting for her when she got there. She was a mile past the Red Rock Junction when she saw it. The debris on the shoulder came into view gradually the way things do at highway speed when the light is not quite right. At first, it registered as shadow, a dark mass against the lighter gravel of the shoulder. Then it resolved into shape. A motorcycle, large a Harley-Davidson by the look of it, lying on its side against the guardrail, the chrome catching morning light. Behind it, spread across the base of the cliff face, a fresh scar of displaced rock, pale limestone, and red sandstone mixed together in a pile that had no business being at the bottom of a cliff that had been stable for years. And at the edge of that pile, barely visible, a hand. Clara's foot came off the accelerator without a conscious decision. The Bronco slowed. She had seen enough in 15 years of trauma nursing to know what a hand moving in that particular way meant. Not the relaxed movement of someone resting, the deliberate, exhausted, urgent movement of someone trying to dig themselves free. She pulled onto the shoulder and the tires crunched over gravel, and she sat for exactly 2 seconds with the engine running and both hands on the wheel. The motorcycle was large and heavy and old. The vest visible on the man trapped beneath the rocks was black leather. She could see even from the truck the patches on the back. The main patch was a skull with cross wrenches beneath it, and above it in an arc the words Iron Cross. Below in another arc, Arizona. Clara knew the name. Everyone in northern Arizona knew the name. The Iron Cross Motorcycle Club had been operating out of Flagstaff in Phoenix for 30 years. They were not subtle about what they were. The Flagstaff police had spent considerable resources over the years attempting to build cases against various members. Some of those efforts had resulted in convictions. Most had not. This was the kind of man she had stopped for. She sat with the engine running for those 2 seconds and felt the full weight of what the sensible choice was. She had a phone. She could call 911 and report the accident and drive away and let the people whose job it was to handle this kind of situation handle it. She was 73 years old with a failing heart and no obligation to any stranger on this road, least of all this one. And then she heard Henry's voice. Not literally. She was not a woman who believed in literal visitations, but she heard it the way you hear the voice of someone you loved for 45 years, the way their particular cadence and their particular choice of words becomes part of the architecture of your own thinking. Clara, he would have said, when you see someone who needs help, you don't ask who they are. You ask who you are. She killed the engine and got out of the truck. The heat hit her at once dense and physical, 103 degrees at 8:30 in the morning. She walked quickly, not running, but moving with the efficiency of someone for whom urgency was not a new condition. The hand was still moving. She could hear, as she got closer, the low sound of a man in pain, not crying out, just the involuntary vocalization of someone pushing through something that would have stopped most people. She knelt beside him. He was face down in the dirt, a large man, 6'2", at least heavy with muscle that had not entirely softened with age. Gray hair matted with blood at the back of his skull. The rocks had him from the waist down, the largest one, a piece of limestone the size of a car door, pressing down across his left leg. His right hand was free and had been trying to find purchase in the loose gravel, trying to drag the rest of him forward. His face, when she turned his head carefully, was weathered and strong, a face that had been outdoors most of its life, and it was tight with pain but conscious. His eyes found hers, gray eyes, sharp despite everything. She said, "Sir, can you hear me?" He said, "Yeah." She checked his pulse at the carotid, strong but elevated. Breathing was shallow but not labored. The head wound was bleeding freely, but head wounds always bled freely. It did not necessarily indicate the severity of the underlying injury. The leg was the problem. She could not assess the leg without getting the rock off him first. She said, "My name is Clara. I'm a nurse. I'm going to get this rock off you," he said. And there was something in his voice that surprised her even then, even in those first moments. "You don't have to do this." She said, "I know." The Bronco's emergency kit was where Henry had always kept it bolted to the floor of the cargo area, a green metal box that had not been opened in 4 years. Clara was relieved to find that Henry's habit of maintaining things had extended even to equipment he never expected to use. The hydraulic jack was in working order. The 3-foot section of steel pipe that Henry had added to the kit because he had understood physics better than most people she had ever met was still there. She went back to the man and positioned the jack under the edge of the largest boulder, taking 30 seconds to find the placement that would give her the best mechanical advantage. The steel pipe extended the jack handle. Henry's voice again from years ago, teaching her in the way he always taught her, conversationally without condescension, "Force equals weight times distance, Clara. The longer the lever, the easier the lift. You don't need strength, you need geometry." She said to the man, "When I lift, you pull yourself forward. Don't think about the pain, just move." He looked at her steadily. He said, "Okay." She pushed down on the pipe. The boulder moved. 1 inch, 2 inches. The man made a sound that she would not forget, a sound from somewhere below, conscious expression, from the place where the body registers damage that the mind is not yet ready to process. But he moved. She felt the resistance change as his weight shifted, and she held the pressure steady, arms shaking back, burning, and he dragged himself forward through the dirt fingernails, leaving tracks in the gravel, and then he was clear. She released the jack. The boulder settled back with a grinding finality. She went to work. The leg was fractured in 2 places. She could tell from the deformation through the fabric of his jeans. But the bones were not displaced, which meant the blood loss, though significant, was manageable. She packed the head wound with gauze from her kit and applied pressure with one hand while she constructed a tourniquet with the other. She had done this in worse conditions. She had done this on the deck of a ship in the North Atlantic in a February storm, with the vessel rolling 20 degrees and the patient screaming. This was dirt and heat and silence. It was almost peaceful by comparison. The man watched her work. His breathing was steadying as the tourniquet took effect. After a few minutes, he said, "You're good at this." She said, "I've had practice." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Iron Cross. You saw the patch." She said, "I did." He said, "Most people would have kept driving." She said, "Most people aren't me." She splinted his leg with a piece of 2x4 from the Bronco's cargo area, a piece of lumber Henry had placed there years ago for reasons Clara had never asked about, but was now profoundly grateful for. She wrapped it with medical tape and strips of cloth from her emergency kit. It was field medicine, rough and functional, but it would hold. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was perhaps 68 years old, she guessed. The kind of man who had been physically powerful his whole life and had not entirely lost that quality, though time and hard living had layered other things over it. There was something else in his face now, something beyond the pain, an urgency that she recognized as distinct from the urgency of injury. She said, "What's your name?" He said, "Cole Donovan." She said, "Cole, I'm going to get you into my truck. We're going to my place 12 miles south. I'm going to properly dress these wounds. And then you're going to tell me what's actually going on, because a man doesn't ride alone on this road with 250 pounds of tension in his jaw just because he felt like a morning ride." Cole Donovan looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "How far is 12 miles?" She said, "About 15 minutes. Can you hold on that long?" He said, "I've held on through worse." She believed him. Getting Cole into the Bronco was the hardest physical thing Clara had done in 10 years. He was 240 pounds of muscle and leather, and she was 73 years old with a heart that a cardiologist had described that same morning as significantly fatigued. She used leverage. She used the running board. She used a technique Henry had shown her once for moving patients who could not help themselves, a technique that had something to do with angles and center of gravity and trusting the geometry more than the muscle. It took 20 minutes. When Cole was finally in the passenger seat, Clara stood beside the truck for a moment with her hands on her knees, breathing through her nose, waiting for the dizziness to pass. Then she got in and started driving. They did not talk much on the drive south. The radio played something she did not register. Cole sat with his head back against the headrest, jaw set against the pane, looking out at the desert with the concentrated expression of a man who is keeping himself conscious through pure will. Clara drove and thought about what she had seen in his eyes when she had first told him her name. Not just pain, not just gratitude. Something specific. Something that needed to be somewhere. The ranch appeared at the end of the dirt track the way it always did, small and solid. In the color of the earth, it sat on a house that had been built to last rather than to impress. Clara pulled up to the front door and helped Cole inside and got him onto the bed in the guest room, the room that had been Henry's workspace and then his sick room, and then for the past 6 years simply empty. She worked methodically. She cleaned the head wound with antiseptic and sutured it with the field suture kit she kept in her medical bag. 12 stitches, careful and even. She removed the field splint and replaced it with a proper one wooden slats padded with gauze, wrapped tightly with medical bandaging. The fractures were stable. He would not be walking on it for weeks, but he was not going to lose the leg. When she finished, she washed her hands in the basin and dried them on a clean towel and sat in the chair beside the bed, the same chair she had sat in for the last months of Henry's life. And she looked at Cole Donovan and said, "Now, tell me." Cole was quiet for a moment. His gray eyes moved to the window, to the dry meadow beyond it, to the middle distance where things were simpler. Then he looked back at her. He said, "His name is Harlan Reed, Doc Reed, 70 years old, retired Army doctor, 25 years of service, Gulf War II peacekeeping deployments. He lives alone in a trailer park outside Phoenix. He volunteers at the VA hospital 3 days a week. He has no family except me." He paused, breathed. He said 3 days ago he was driving home from the VA hospital. He took a wrong turn in the dark and ended up in an industrial area south of Phoenix that he had no business being in. And he saw something. Men loading people into the make of a refrigerated truck. Old people. Not willingly. They were being moved the way you move cargo when you don't particularly care about damage. Clara said, "He witnessed a kidnapping." Cole said he witnessed what he recognized. Harlan Reed spent 25 years as a military doctor in places where people disappeared. He knew what he was looking at. He called me because he did not trust the local police, not in that area, not with what he thought he was looking at. He told me what he had seen, and I told him to go home and stay inside, and I would figure out what to do. He stopped. Clara said, and then he went silent. His phone went dead. The next morning, I received a call from a number I did not recognize, a voice run through a distortion filter, so I could not tell age or sex or anything useful. They said they had Doc. They said if I wanted him back alive, I would bring $300,000 in cash to a location they would specify within 48 hours of that call, and I would come alone, and I would not contact law enforcement. They said they had people who would know if I did. He looked at her. He said I was on my way to deliver that money when the rocks came down. That was not an accident. Someone knew I was going to be on that road this morning. Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands. Then she said, "Someone inside your organization." Cole said, "Someone I trust or trusted." She said, "How many people knew your route?" He said, 5. My inner circle. Boone Taggart, my vice president, 58 years old, with me for 30 years. Aldrich Pemberton, the club's lawyer. 52, educated, precise, the kind of man who wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and who has kept me out of serious legal trouble on 3 separate occasions. Cressida Falke, our logistics coordinator, 49, former Army logistics officer. Mace Duval, our enforcer 55, a man of very few words, and Royce Haller, our internal security chief 60, former Marine. One of those 5 people tried to kill me this morning, Clara said, and Doc Reed is being held by people who traffic elderly individuals for organ harvesting. Cole said, that's what I believe. Based on what Doc described, the way the people were being moved, the age range, the facility he saw them being loaded near. There are buyers for kidneys, livers, corneas, people who don't ask questions about provenance. It's a market. It functions like a market. Clara stood. She walked to the window and looked at the dry meadow and the distant red rocks. The sun was fully up now, hot and direct, flattening the color out of everything. She said quietly, "How many did he see being loaded?" Cole said. He wasn't certain, at least 6 or 7, maybe more. She stood at the window for a long moment. She thought about a morning in 1987 aboard the USNS Comfort in the North Atlantic, when they had received 17 casualties from a training accident aboard a destroyer, and she had worked for 9 straight hours without sitting down, moving from one to the next, making the decisions that needed to be made, not because she had been instructed to be calm, but because calm was simply what the situation required. She turned from the window. She said, "The kidnappers called yesterday morning. That means you have less than 36 hours from right now before their deadline." She looked at him directly. "Which means we don't waste any more time on this road." Cole stared at her. He said, "We..." She said, "Where does the money come from?" He said, "I have it. 300,000 in cash. It was on the bike." She said, "The bike is still on the highway." He said, "I know." She said, "Then we need to go get it. Tonight after dark before someone else finds it." She looked at him. "You can't ride. You can't drive. Which means you need someone who can." Cole studied her face. He said, "You're not serious." She said, "The closet in this room belonged to my husband, Henry. He was Army. 2 tours in Germany during the Cold War, then 30 years as a civilian machinist and welder. He was also the most self-sufficient human being I have ever known." She walked to the closet and opened it. Inside on the shelf above Henry's hanging work shirts, a Remington 8.70 shotgun, a Colt 19, 11 pistol boxes of ammunition arranged in the careful way that Henry arranged everything. Henry believed in being prepared for things you prayed would never happen. She said, "He spent 4 years teaching me to shoot and to drive and to fix what was broken and to keep moving when everything in you wanted to stop." She looked at Cole. "I have not used any of it in 6 years, but I remember every bit of it." Cole was looking at her with an expression she would come to recognize over the following days. It was not quite disbelief. It was something more like recalibration, the expression of a man who has organized the world in a particular way and is now being presented with evidence that his organization requires revision. He said, "Why would you do this for a stranger?" She was quiet for a moment. The question deserved a real answer. She said that my husband died 6 years ago. Every day since then, I have woken up and gone through the motions of living without any particular confidence that the motions meant anything. I was a nurse for 15 years. I was a wife for 45 years. I knew every day of those years exactly what I was for. And then those things ended, and I stopped knowing. She looked at him directly. She said, "When I saw your hand under those rocks this morning, something happened that has not happened in a long time. I knew exactly what I was supposed to do. I did not think about it. I just knew. And that feeling, Cole, that clarity I have, missed it more than I can explain." She turned back to the closet. She said, "So I am not doing this out of recklessness. I am not doing this because I do not understand the danger. I am doing it because I need to know that my life still has a use. And right now, your friend needs someone who is not afraid of what is coming." She took the Colt from the shelf and checked the magazine with the automatic efficiency of long practice. Full. She set it on the dresser. She said, "Now, tell me everything you know about Harlan Reed and where he might be held. We have 36 hours and we are going to use all of them." Cole Donovan was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said, his full name is Harlan James Reed. He grew up in Concord, New Hampshire. He joined the Army at 22 because his family had no money for medical school, and the Army offered him a path. He spent 25 years becoming the best trauma surgeon they had in the field. He retired in 2003 and moved to Arizona because he had spent his whole life in cold places and wanted for whatever time he had left to be warm. He stopped. His voice had changed. He said, in 1979, I was 23 years old. My father had just drunk himself to death, which was the only reliable thing he ever did. I had nothing. No money, no insurance, no future worth the name. I was riding too fast on a road outside Tucson because riding fast was the only thing that made the noise in my head quiet down, and I hit a patch of gravel and went down hard and broke my back in 3 places. I woke up in a man's garage. He had found me on the roadside and loaded me into his truck and taken me home and put me on his workbench. He looked at the ceiling. He said he operated on me with tools he had sterilized in his kitchen because no hospital would take me without insurance, and no insurance would have me with my history. He spent 6 months nursing me back to the point where I could walk. He never asked for money. When I could finally stand on my own, I asked him why he had done it. He said, because I am a doctor and doctors save lives. That is the whole job. He looked at Clara. He said, I told him I would pay him back. He said, do not pay me back. Pay it forward. Help someone else the way I helped you. Clara felt something in her throat. She recognized it as the specific feeling of hearing someone else articulate something you had been living without knowing it had words. She said, he sounds like Henry. Cole said, he is the best man I have ever known. And he is somewhere out there right now, and I am lying in this bed with 36 hours left on the clock. And the people who have him are not patient people. Clara looked at him steadily. She said, then we do not waste any more time. She went to the kitchen and made coffee because some things you do regardless of what else is happening, and she thought about what came next. The money had to be retrieved. Cole needed Boone Taggart, the one person he was most willing to trust. A plan needed to be built. At 9 o'clock that evening, she drove back up Highway 89 alone, the Bronco's headlights cutting through the dark. The Harley was where they had left it visible in her headlights as she came around the curve lying against the guardrail like something abandoned. She pulled over and got out and walked to the bike. The backpack was still strapped to the rear rack, secured with a bungee cord that had survived the rockfall intact. She unstrapped it and carried it back to the truck. $300,000 in wrapped bills sealed in plastic. Heavy, real. She drove home with the money in the back seat and thought about a man she had never met who had spent 25 years saving lives and was now somewhere in the Arizona dark, waiting to be saved himself. At 1 o'clock in the morning, a Harley came up the dirt track with its headlight off the engine, a low rumble in the night. Clara was sitting on the front porch with Henry's Remington across her knees when the rider came to a stop and killed the engine. He was a big man, 58 years old, with a gray beard that had not been trimmed in recent memory, and the kind of eyes that had seen too many things and had stopped being surprised by most of them. He looked at Clara on the porch with the shotgun, and he said, you must be the woman who saved Cole's life. She said, and you must be Boone Taggart. He said, yes, ma'am. She said, come inside. We have a great deal to discuss and not much time to discuss it. Boone Taggart sat at Clara's kitchen table and listened without interrupting, while Cole, propped up on pillows at the table's end, explained everything. The kidnapping, the ransom, the 7 victims, the attempted ambush on Highway 89, the traitors somewhere in the inner circle. Boone's face went through several things during this recounting and settled at the end of it into something that was very still and very cold. He said, someone in the 5. Cole said, yes. Boone said, you think it is Aldrich. Cole said, I do not know who it is. I do not want to know until we have Doc back. Suspicion makes people act in ways that create problems. Boone looked at Clara. He said, what is your role in this? Clara said, I am going with you. Boone said, no offense, ma'am, but you are 73 years old. So Clara said, I am, and I am also the most qualified trauma nurse within 50 miles of this table. I am familiar with the operational terrain because I have lived in this area for 30 years. And I have two things that none of your people have. Boone said, which are, she said, no one knows my face and no one would ever look at me and think threat. Boone looked at Cole. Cole looked back at Boone. There was a long silence that contained Clara sensed 30 years of communication compressed into a few seconds. Boone said, she is not wrong. Clara set her coffee cup on the table. She said, here is what I need from you. 6 men, not from the inner circle. People further down the chain, people who do not know anything about this operation yet. People you would trust with your life. Boone said, I have those people. She said, good. Then here is what we are going to do. They planned until 3 in the morning. Clara drew the layout of the location on a piece of paper working from the description Cole had relayed from the kidnappers' redirect. Entry points, sight lines, positions for Boone's men, a secondary approach from the rear for Clara. At one point, Boone said, you have done something like this before. Clara said, not exactly like this, but I have worked in situations where the plan mattered more than the firepower, and the person who keeps their head when everything goes wrong is worth more than 3 people with guns. She looked at both of them. She said, we get Doc out. We get all 7 of them out. And we do it before anyone has to die who does not have to die. When Boone finally stood to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at Clara with an expression she had not expected from a man like him. It was something close to respect. Not the polite kind, the earned kind. He said, Cole said, you are the woman who could not drive past. She said, that is right. He said, ma'am, I have ridden with a lot of people in 30 years. And the ones you want beside you when it matters are not always the ones you would expect. He went out into the night. His Harley started and the sound faded down the dirt track toward the highway. Clara sat alone at the kitchen table after he left. The house was quiet the way it had been quiet for 6 years. But tonight, the quiet felt different. It felt like the pause before something rather than the continuation of nothing. She picked up the photograph of her and Henry from the shelf above the kitchen window. Their wedding day in 1973. Both of them young. Both of them certain of the whole world arranged ahead of them like a road they had not driven yet. She said to him quietly, I do not know if I am going to come back from this, but I think you would understand. I think you would say, when it matters, you do not think, you just act. She put the photograph back. She went to bed. She set her alarm for 5 o'clock, which was when she always woke up because 50 years of discipline did not dissolve just because the world had changed around it. And for the first time in 6 years, she fell asleep quickly because she knew exactly what tomorrow was for. The alarm went off at 5 o'clock, and Clara was already awake. She had been lying in the dark for 20 minutes listening to the desert breathe. The coyotes had been active around 3 in the morning. Their calls moving across the dry meadow in patterns that suggested something had disturbed them. Probably a javelina working the scrub line at the property's edge. Now they were quiet. The sky outside her window had not yet begun to lighten, but had shifted from true black to the deep blue-gray that preceded Tune in the desert, the color of something thinking about becoming something else. She dressed in the dark, practical clothes the kind Henry had always approved of. Dark jeans, a long-sleeve shirt despite the heat that was already building her old work boots that had been resold twice and still had years left in them. She put Henry's Colt 1911 in the holster she had worn exactly once before at a range outside Sedona 6 years ago when she had gone to see if she still remembered how. She had remembered. She clipped the holster to her belt and pulled the shirt over it. She made coffee. She made enough for 3. Cole was already awake when she brought him a cup. He was sitting up in the guest bed with his leg elevated on 2 pillows, and he had the focused inward look of a man running through a mental checklist for the 4th or 5th time. He took the coffee and wrapped both hands around it and said nothing for a moment. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to change. He said, "How long have you been awake?" she said. "A while," he said. "You should have slept." She said, "I did sleep. 60 years of getting up before dawn does not negotiate." She sat in the chair beside the bed and they drank their coffee in the quiet that had formed between them over the past 20 hours. A quiet that was not uncomfortable, the kind that develops between people who have moved past the stage of needing to fill silence with reassurance. Cole said, "I have been thinking about the five." She said, and he said, "Aldrich Pemberton. He is the one I keep coming back to." His daughter, Nora, she has been in and out of treatment facilities for 3 years. The last facility, the one she is in now, it costs $11,000 a month. Aldrich's billing rate is good, but not that good. I know he has been stretched financially. He mentioned it once, just once, the way men mention things they are ashamed of, sideways looking somewhere else. Clara said financial pressure is one of the oldest levers there is. Cole said, "I know, but Aldrich has been my lawyer for 25 years. He has kept me out of situations that would have ended everything. He knows more about my operation than anyone except Boone." She said, which makes him the most valuable person they could have turned. Cole was quiet for a moment. He said, "I do not want it to be him." She said, "That is understandable. But wanting and knowing are different things. Right now we focus on Doc. After that, we find out the truth." He looked at her. He said, "How are you this calm?" She thought about it honestly. She said, "I spent 15 years in situations where fear was a luxury I could not afford. Not because I was not afraid I was, but because the work needed doing regardless. At some point, the habit becomes the character." She stood and took his empty cup. She said, "Boone will be here by 9. The meet is at 6 this evening. That gives us 8 hours to be ready." Boone arrived at 8:53 with 6 men and 3 pickup trucks that he parked in a line along the dirt track rather than clustering them near the house, a small tactical decision that Clara noted and appreciated. The men were between 45 and 60, all of them carrying the particular stillness of people who had been in serious situations before and had learned that stillness was a form of preparation. Boone introduced them: Garrett Slade Knox, Whitfield, Pierce, Drummond Remington, Crossdale Stoner, and Cal Holloway. None of them said much when they saw Clara. Boone had clearly briefed them. They treated her with the specific courtesy of men who have been told that someone is important without being told why, and are waiting to see the why demonstrated. They gathered around the kitchen table. Cole had been moved to a chair at the head of it, his splinted leg extended on a second chair, the map Clara had drawn during the night spread in front of him. Boone stood to his left. Clara stood to his right. Cole spoke for 15 minutes without stopping. He described the warehouse, its location, its history as an auto parts distribution center that had gone bankrupt in 2015, its layout as best he knew it from having driven past it twice in previous years. Entry points, the likely position of the hostages, the number of armed men they could expect, which his best estimate put between 8 and 12. When he finished, Clara spoke. She described the plan as they had built it the night before. Boone's 6 men would approach from 3 directions in the trucks, moving into position, beginning at 5 o'clock, a full hour before the meet. They would establish a perimeter at 300 yards and hold it. Cole would go in through the main entrance at exactly 6 o'clock with the money. His role was to keep the exchange going, to buy time, to keep the principal actors focused on him. Clara and one of Boone's men would approach from the rear loading dock, enter through the eastern service door, and locate the hostages. The primary objective was to get all 7 people out of the building before any shooting started. If shooting started before that was accomplished, Boone's men moved in. Del Stoner, who had not spoken until this point, said, "What if the hostages are not in the basement?" Clara said. "Then we adapt. But if I were holding 7 people in that building, the basement is where I would put them. 1 entry point, controllable, no windows. It is the logical choice." Stoner considered this and nodded. Knox Whitfield said, "What is your exit if it goes wrong at the rear?" Clara had thought about this. She described 2 alternate routes from the loading dock, one back through the eastern wall. If the interior became untenable, one across the rear lot to the fence line, where Boone would have a truck positioned. Boone said, "You have done this before." Clara said, "Not this specifically. But I have worked in environments where the plan was the difference between people living and people not living. You learn to think in contingencies. They spent another hour on details, position, signals, timing. Clara insisted on rehearsing the communication sequence 3 times until every man at the table could run it without hesitation. Boone watched her run the rehearsal with an expression that had moved some distance from the polite skepticism of the night before. At noon, they ate. Clara made sandwiches because people made poor decisions when they were hungry, and she was not willing to let poor decisions be the reason this went wrong. The men ate at the kitchen table and talked about things that had nothing to do with the evening ahead, the way soldiers do before operations, talking about trucks and weather and the price of things, because talking about the actual thing makes it larger and you want it to stay manageable. Cole ate in his chair and watched Clara move through the kitchen with the fluid economy of someone who had been managing crisis for 50 years. At 2 o'clock, Boone pulled Clara aside in the front room. He said quietly, "I need you to know something." She said, "All right." He said, "I have ridden with Cole Donovan for 30 years. I have been in situations that I do not discuss in polite company. I have seen people fall apart when things went wrong, and I have seen people hold together." He looked at her. "You are the steadiest person I have met in a long time, man or woman. And I want you to know that when we are in there tonight, if something happens to me, these men will follow your direction. I have told them that." Clara looked at him steadily. She said, "Nothing is going to happen to you, Boone." He said, "Maybe not, but I wanted you to know anyway." She said, "Thank you. Now let us make sure the plan is tight enough that it does not need to matter." At 3:15, Cole's phone rang. The number was blocked. Cole put it on speaker without being asked because he had understood from the previous call that Clara processed information faster when she could hear it directly. The voice was the same one as before, filtered through electronic distortion until it was genderless and ageless and somehow more threatening for being unplaceable. It said, "Change of plans, Mr. Donovan." Cole's jaw tightened. He said, "I am listening." The voice said, "We have become aware that you have been making preparations that go beyond our agreement. The warehouse is no longer the location. We are moving to a secondary site. You will receive coordinates in 1 hour. You will come alone. The money will come with you. And the additional people you have assembled, the ones in the 3 pickup trucks currently parked on your property, they will stay exactly where they are." The line went dead. The kitchen was silent. Clara said very quietly, "They are watching the property." Boone moved to the window, staying to one side of it, and looked out at the dirt track. He said, "There is nothing on the road. They would need a long glass from the ridgeline to see the trucks." Clara said, "Or they have a phone." She looked at Cole. "Someone called them in the last 3 hours. Someone who knew Boone was here with 6 men." Cole's face had gone very still. He said, "The only people who knew Boone was coming here are the people at this table." Boone said, "Which means one of my 6 men." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Clara said, "Does it change the plan?" Boone said, "It changes everything. We do not know which one. If we move together, the compromised person tells them again." Clara thought for 30 seconds. Then she said, "We separate them right now before the coordinates come through. Boone, you take the 6 men and split them into 2 groups with separate vehicles and separate roads and no communication between them until they are at the secondary site. Neither group knows where the other is going until they arrive. The compromised person can only warn about half the force." Boone looked at her. He said, "That cuts our coordination." She said, "Yes. But we keep the element of partial surprise, and we find out which group the information comes from when we see which half is anticipated at the site." Cole said, "That is a significant risk." Clara said, "Everything from this point forward is a significant risk. We are choosing which risks we can manage." Cole looked at Boone. Boone looked at Clara. The same compressed communication as before, but faster this time. Boone said, "All right, I will split them now." He went outside. Through the window, Clara watched him talk to the 6 men without being able to hear the words. She was looking for the specific quality of a person receiving information they are already in the process of deciding how to transmit to someone else. She watched all 6 faces and she could not read it in any of them, which meant either she was wrong about the leak or the person was very good. The coordinates came through 57 minutes later, not the warehouse. A location 40 miles further north, an abandoned copper mining complex that had been inactive since the 1960s.
It's all right.
A collection
I'm
of
here.
deteriorating structures and rusted
so
equipment
much.
scattered across a
I
dry
know,
mesa
dear.
that could be
Just
approached from
breathe.
3 directions
Thank
but
you.
controlled from one. Clara
You
recognized the
have
strategic
no
logic
right
immediately.
to be here.
Higher ground, open approach, defensible.
This is my
Anyone
diner.
coming would be
Get
visible
out.
long before they arrived. She said to Cole,
Thank
chose
you
well.
all so
He
much.
said they always
Your
do.
support
At
means
4:30,
the
Boone's
world
2
to
groups
us.
departed in separate
Together.
vehicles by separate routes with instructions to be in position by 5:45 and hold until they heard from Cole. Clara watched them go from the porch. The dust from the trucks settled slowly in the still afternoon air. She went inside and sat with Cole for 20 minutes. He said I should have the letter with me. She said, "What letter?" He reached into his vest and produced a folded piece of paper. He said, "I wrote it this morning, for Doc, in case." Clara looked at the folded paper. She said, "You will give it to him yourself." Cole said, "Maybe, but I want it with me either way." She did not argue with that. At 5 o'clock, they loaded into the Bronco. Clara driving, Cole in the passenger seat with the money in a duffel bag between his feet, the Colt on Clara's hip, the Remington behind the seat accessible. They drove north in the failing afternoon light, the sun dropping behind the western ridgeline and pulling the temperature down with it in that abrupt way. The desert had a 20-degree shift in 40 minutes. The landscape changed as they drove further north, the saguaro giving way to scrubland, and then to the broken terrain of old mining country. The earth here, a different color, rust and gray, worked over and abandoned. Cole said Doc told me once that the reason he never charged for the work he did outside official channels, the garage operations, the cases where the patient had nothing, was that he had realized early that medicine was only worth anything if it reached the people who needed it most, not the people who could pay the most. He said the oath was clear on this, and most of medicine had simply chosen to ignore it. Clara said, "He sounds like a man who meant what he said." Cole said he is the most honest person I have ever known. Which is a strange thing to say about the best friend of the president of a motorcycle club. He smiled without much humor. "But there it is," she said. "When this is over, I would like to meet him properly." Cole said, "When this is over, I will make sure you do." They left the Bronco on a dirt turnout a quarter mile from the mining complex behind a low ridge that provided cover. The walk-in was slow because of Cole's leg, even with the improvised crutch Boone had fashioned from a length of pipe before leaving. Clara took Cole's weight on her left side, and they moved across the broken ground in the cooling dark, both of them quiet, both of them watching the terrain. The complex came into view as they crested the ridge. It was larger than Clara had expected from the coordinates alone. A central clearing surrounded by the remnants of the processing buildings, roofless, their walls still standing, their interiors open to the sky. Generator-powered floodlights had been set up in the clearing, 3 of them casting hard white light that turned everything inside their reach flat and shadowless, and everything outside them impenetrably dark. 3 black SUVs were parked in a triangle formation in the clearing. Men moved between them and the buildings, 8 that Clara could count from her vantage, possibly more inside the structures. And in the center of the clearing, arranged in 2 rows of chairs, 7 people. Elderly, bound at the wrists and ankles with zip ties. Their clothes were not the clothes of people who had been cared for in the last several days. 2 of the women were holding each other's bound hands. One of the men had his head bowed. Another sat upright with the particular posture of someone who has decided that whatever happens, they will meet it with their spine straight. Clara recognized him from Cole's description even at this distance. White-haired, thin, but not frail, with something in his bearing that spoke of decades of practicing authority in situations that did not forgive weakness. Harlan Reed. Doc, alive. She felt Cole go still beside her when he saw him. She put her hand briefly on his arm. She said barely above a whisper, "He is alive. Focus." Cole nodded once. He straightened. Clara said, "I am going around the eastern wall. Give me 15 minutes to get in position before you go in. Do not go in early regardless of what you hear." He said, "If something goes wrong for you in there," she said, "then you improvise. But nothing is going to go wrong." She left him at the ridge and moved along the northern perimeter of the complex in a low crouch, keeping the ruined walls between herself and the clearing. She had moved through worse environments than this. She had moved through the cargo holds of ships in complete darkness with injured men calling out from multiple directions and the ship rolling under her feet. This was ground that held still. She could work with ground that held still. The eastern service door was where Cole had described it from the layout he remembered set into the wall at the far end of the longest processing building. It had been chained, but the chain was not new, and neither was the padlock, and someone had addressed its age with bolt cutters at some point recently enough that the cut ends still had some shine. Clara eased the door open and slipped inside. The interior of the processing building was a ruin of rusted conveyor equipment and collapsed sections of roof, the floor covered in decades of dust and debris. She moved through it toward the far end, toward the opening that looked out onto the clearing where the hostages sat. She found a position behind a section of collapsed conveyor housing that gave her a clear sightline to the central clearing and cover from 3 directions. She checked her watch. 9 minutes. She watched the men in the clearing move and counted again. 9 armed men now visible. The one who stood apart from the others, who moved with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, was positioned near the lead SUV. He was in his early 50s, she estimated. Military posture unmistakable, the kind that outlasted the service by decades. He wore his confidence the way people who have never had reason to question it wear it without any visible effort. She thought, this is a man who has never had someone surprise him. She intended to change that. At exactly 6 o'clock, Cole Donovan walked into the clearing. He came through the main entrance at the western end, moving with the slow deliberateness that his injured leg imposed the duffel bag in his right hand, his left hand visible and empty. The floodlights caught him and he stopped walking and stood in the full light without flinching. There was something in that moment that Clara would think about later, something in the way Cole Donovan stood in that light with a broken leg and a dead friend's life in the balance, and did not look small. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had made a promise and was here to keep it. The leader walked forward. He said, "Mr. Donovan, right on time. Cole said I came for my friend. Let us do this." The leader looked at the duffel bag. He said, "Set it down. Step back." Cole set the bag down. He stepped back. One of the men opened it, rifled through the contents, looked up and nodded. The leader smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone confirming that the mechanism they designed it is working exactly as intended. He said, "Good. Now, Mr. Donovan, we are going to skip past the part where you expect us to honor our agreement, because I think you are intelligent enough to have known that was never the plan." Cole said nothing. The leader drew a pistol and pointed it at Harlan Reed's head. Clara was already moving. She came out of the processing building at a run, which was not the plan, and which she had known might become necessary because plans always have a moment where they require deviation. And the person who cannot recognize that moment and respond to it is the person who loses. The Remington was up, and she was moving toward the nearest row of hostages, and she was shouting loudly, clearly, with 40 years of trained authority in her voice, "Drop it or I drop you." Every armed man in the clearing swung toward the sound. The leader turned from Doc. He looked at Clara, this woman in her 70s running across the clearing with a shotgun, and she watched the calculation move across his face and arrive at the wrong answer. She watched him decide she was not a real threat. He said, "Stop right there, old woman, before you hurt yourself." Clara did not stop. She reached the first row of hostages, grabbed the back of the nearest chair, and dragged it backward with everything she had. The woman in the chair made a sound of terrified surprise. Clara got her to the cover of the nearest ruined wall and went back for the second. The leader shouted something. Two of his men moved toward Clara. Cole drew the backup weapon he had kept concealed, a compact 9mm that Boone had left for him, and put himself between the two men and Clara with the unhurried precision of a man who has fired weapons under pressure many times. He said, "Let her work." The two men stopped. The standoff lasted 4 seconds, which was enough time for Clara to get the second hostage to cover. Then the shooting started from the North Boone's first group and from the South Boone's second, and the clearing became a different kind of place. Clara moved through it the way she had moved through trauma bays on moving ships. She did not look at the gunfire, she looked at the chairs. She looked at the people in the chairs. She moved from one to the next, grabbing, pulling, dragging, not asking whether the person could help her, because some of them could and some of them could not, and in either case, the process was the same. Get hold of them, move them toward cover, and come back for the next one. The third hostage was a man who had been in the military. She could tell from the way he oriented himself the moment he understood what was happening, and immediately tried to use his bound feet to push against the ground and assist her. She appreciated that. Together they made the wall in half the time. The fourth was a small woman, the smallest of the 7, who could not stop crying, but did not fight Clara and did not slow her down. And Clara held her briefly at the wall and said into her ear, "You are safe, I have you. Stay here and stay low." The fifth was a large man, the heaviest of the group, and this one was hard. Clara got hold of his chair and pulled, and the chair moved inches instead of feet, and she adjusted her grip and pulled again, and her back sent up a flare of protest that she acknowledged and filed away and ignored. A round hit the ground 4 feet to her left, then another 2 feet to her right. Someone was targeting her specifically. She got the large man moving by getting low behind him and pushing the chair rather than pulling it, using her body weight instead of her arm strength, and they crossed the clearing in a series of lurching movements that felt agonizingly slow and covered the ground anyway. 5 down, 2 left, one of them was Doc. She went back into the clearing. The firefight was changing shape. 2 of the leader's men were down. Boone's forces had pushed inward from the perimeter, and the leader was shouting orders that were being followed with decreasing precision. The specific disorder of a unit that is beginning to understand it has lost the initiative. Cole was still standing near the entrance, trading shots with measured economy, not wasting ammunition, making every round count the way a man counts rounds when he knows he has a limited number. Clara reached the 6th hostage, an older woman who had somehow maintained a quality of composed determination throughout, and got her moving. As they neared the wall, the woman said, "There is one more." Clara said, "I know. I am going back." The woman grabbed her arm. She said, "You cannot. They are watching you now," Clara said. "Then I will have to be faster than they are watching." She released the woman's grip gently and turned back. The 7th chair. Doc's chair was in the center of the clearing, fully exposed, the most illuminated point in the whole complex. Getting to it meant crossing 30 feet of open ground under active fire with no cover and no speed, because Clara Whitmore was 73 years old and her speed had its limits. She went anyway. She was 10 feet from Doc's chair when the hand came around her throat from behind and the cold pressure of a gun barrel found the back of her skull. A voice said very close to her ear, "You should have kept driving, old woman." Clara went completely still. The shooting continued around them, but there was a pocket of stillness in it now, centered on Clara and the man behind her, and she could feel the peripheral attention of the clearing shifting toward this new situation. She said very calmly, "You are going to have to make a decision in the next few seconds." The man said, "The decision is already made." And then from the chair in front of her, from Doc Harlan Reed, who had been sitting in that chair for 72 hours with his wrists zip-tied at the front with just enough slack to allow limited movement, who had been for all of that time watching and waiting and preserving every ounce of his remaining strength, for exactly this kind of moment, came a rock the size of a large man's fist, thrown with the accuracy of someone who spent his formative years playing baseball in the hills of New Hampshire. It hit the man behind Clara squarely in the face. Clara did not think about what happened next. 40 years of muscle memory drilled into her by a patient and thorough husband on a range outside Sedona executed itself without any direction from her conscious mind. She grabbed the gun hand. She twisted it outward. She drove her knee into the nerve cluster above the man's inner thigh, something Henry had spent an entire afternoon explaining once more precise than the obvious target, more reliably disabling. She brought her elbow down on the back of the man's neck as he buckled. He dropped. She picked up the Remington from where it had fallen. She chambered around. She looked at Doc Harlan Reed. She said, "Thanks, Doc." Doc said, "Anytime, ma'am. Now, could you possibly untie me before something else goes wrong?" She cut his zip ties with the folding knife from her belt and helped him to his feet, and they moved together toward the cover of the eastern wall where the 6 other hostages were waiting. Behind them, the clearing was resolving. 3 of the leader's men were down. Boone's forces had pushed in from the perimeter, and the remaining men had retreated to the SUVs, and 2 of the SUVs were moving, accelerating toward the western exit, spraying gravel. The 3rd SUV made it 20 yards before Remington Cross shot out both rear tires, and it swerved into a pile of mining debris and stopped. Then it was quiet. The specific quality of quiet that follows gunfire in an open space is unlike any other quiet. It has a texture to it, a ringing presence, the sound of ears readjusting to a world without detonation. Clara stood with her back against the eastern wall with 7 people around her, all of them alive, all of them frightened, most of them shaking, and of them sitting very still with his eyes closed and his hands folded in his lap as if he were somewhere private. Doc Reed opened his eyes and looked at Clara. He said, "You must be the woman Cole told me about." She said, "I must be." He said, "You saved his life." She said he would have found another way. Doc said he would not have. Cole Donovan has many qualities, but creative problem solving under rocks is not historically among them. She almost laughed. It surprised her. Cole came around the edge of the wall on his makeshift crutch, moving faster than a man with a fractured leg had any business moving. When he saw Doc, he stopped. They looked at each other across the distance of 45 years and whatever had happened in between, and Cole said, "You stubborn old man." Doc said, "You came." Cole said, "Of course I came." He crossed the remaining distance and they held each other the way men hold each other when they have stopped caring how it looks briefly but completely, and Clara looked away because some moments belonged only to the people in them. Boone appeared at her shoulder. He said 2 vehicles got out. The leader was in one of them. She said, "I know." He said, "We have a man from the 3rd vehicle. He is talking." She said, "What is he saying?" Boone said, "The name at the top of this operation is Cassian Wolf, former Delta Force dishonorably discharged in 2009. The leader we just engaged was a field manager, not the principal. Wolf has never appeared on scene directly." Clara looked at the dark horizon where the 2 SUVs had disappeared. She said, "So it is not over." Boone said, "Not yet." He paused, then said, "There is something else. Del Stoner came to me 10 minutes ago. Before we split into groups this afternoon, he saw Knox Whitfield make a call from behind his truck. Stoner did not think anything of it at the time. Now he does. Clara said Whitfield is your leak. Boone said was my leak. He is currently zip-tied to a post on the eastern side of the perimeter. The FBI can have him when they arrive." Clara nodded. She looked at the 7 freed people around her. She thought one thread pulled loose and the whole thing begins to unravel. She said, "Then let us make sure it keeps unraveling." Later, when Boone's men had called in the FBI coordinates and the worst of the adrenaline had burned off, and the full weight of the evening was settling into tired muscles and tired bones, Clara sat on the running board of Boone's truck and let herself stop moving for the first time in 4 hours. Del Stoner came and sat beside her. He said, "For the record, I want you to know it was not me." She said, "I know." He said, "How?" She said, "Because when Boone split the groups, I watched your face. And when I watch someone receive information, I am looking for the quality of a person who is immediately deciding what to do with it rather than simply receiving it. Your face received it and stayed. Stoner was quiet for a moment. He said, "I told Boone about Whitfield as soon as I knew for certain." She said, "You did the right thing." He looked at her. He said, "Ma'am, I have seen a lot of things in my life, but I have never seen anyone do what you did tonight. Running back into that clearing 4 times. That was not bravery. That was something else." Clara thought about it. She said it was purpose. There is a difference. She looked at the sky. The stars over the Arizona desert on a clear night in July were extravagant, unself-conscious, the kind of display that made the smallness of individual troubles clear without diminishing them. She thought about Cassian Wolfe, who had never appeared in person, who had sent other men to do the dangerous work while remaining somewhere safe and invisible. She thought former Delta Force, the kind of training that turned men into instruments of directed violence, so precisely calibrated that they became something beyond dangerous. The kind of man who planned for contingencies the way Clara planned for them as a matter of reflex. She thought, this is not finished. From the other side of the truck, she could hear Cole and Doc talking, their voices low. The particular music of 2 old men who know each other down to the bone, talking about nothing important, with the ease of people for whom communication had long since stopped requiring effort. She thought about 7 people who were going home tonight who had not expected to go home. She thought about a woman named Clara Whitmore who had driven past this road 1,000 times and had on one particular morning decided to stop. She thought Henry would have understood all of it. She put her hands on her knees and pushed herself to her feet. There was still work left to do. 3 months passed the way time passes when you are no longer simply waiting for it to end. Clara woke each morning at 5 o'clock and drove the 31 miles to Phoenix in the Bronco, and each morning the drive felt different from the drive it had been before. Not easier exactly, not lighter, but purposeful in a way that had been absent for 6 years, the way a compass feels different in your hand when it is actually pointing towards something rather than spinning. The building that would become the Henry Whitmore Center sat on the eastern edge of Phoenix in an industrial district that had been transitioning slowly towards something else for the past decade. Old warehouses converted into gyms and breweries and art studios. The neighborhood in the middle of becoming without yet knowing what it was becoming. The Iron Cross MC had owned the warehouse for 11 years, using it for storage, and the occasional gathering that it was better not to describe in detail. Cole had signed it over to the newly established nonprofit corporation in August, and the renovation had begun in September, with crews that Boone Taggart organized and partially staffed himself. Clara had not expected the bikers to be good at construction. She had revised that assessment within the first week. The medical wing took shape under Doc Reed's supervision. He moved through the space with the focused energy of a man who had spent 25 years making do with what was available and now presented with actual resources intended to use every one of them. He designed the examination rooms with the obsessive practicality of a field surgeon, everything within reach. Nothing decorative that did not also serve a function. Lighting that was honest about what it illuminated. They hired a counselor, Dr. Margot Ellery, 44 years old, who had spent 12 years working with trafficking survivors in Los Angeles, and who arrived at the warehouse on her first day of consultation, looked at the raw concrete walls and the extension cords running to borrowed construction lights, and said, "I have worked in worse. Let us build something real." They found a social worker, a job trainer, a legal advocate who specialized in exploitation cases. They partnered with 2 Phoenix hospitals for referrals and with a veterans advocacy organization for housing assistance. The network grew the way networks grow when the need is genuine and the people building them are not doing it for credit. Aldrich Pemberton had been arrested 6 weeks after the mining complex rescue, taken into federal custody on charges that included conspiracy, obstruction, and material support of criminal enterprise. He had cooperated from the first hour of his interrogation, providing names, financial records, and operational details that the FBI described as significantly useful. His attorney had negotiated a sentencing agreement that would keep him out of prison if his cooperation led to successful prosecutions, which it had. He was not a free man in any meaningful sense, bound by the terms of his agreement and the weight of what he had done, but he was present in the world, taking his daughter to her treatment appointments, trying to find a way to live with the specific damage that desperation and cowardice had produced. Cole had not spoken to him since the night he had called and Aldrich had confessed. That silence was its own verdict. The 7 original hostages had scattered to their various lives after the mining complex, some back to family, some to situations less certain. 3 of them, over the weeks that followed, had made their way back into Clara's orbit. Helen Marchand, 68, a retired school teacher from Scottsdale, who had been taken from a parking lot outside a grocery store, had shown up at the ranch 3 weeks after the rescue with a casserole and an offer to help with whatever needed doing. She had not left. She now managed the center's administrative operations with the same precise energy she had presumably once applied to 8th grade English. Frank Burgess, former Marine with the photographs of his grandchildren, had become the center's head of security and facilities, a role that suited him with the specific rightness of a man who has found the thing his particular combination of skills was assembled for. He repaired what broke, reinforced what was weak, and stood at the entrance on intake days with a quality of calm authority that made frightened people feel almost immediately less frightened. Sarah Tolliver, the one Clara had identified during the rescue as a nurse, by the way she held herself even while bound to a chair, was a retired emergency room nurse from Mesa who had gone back to work as a volunteer in the medical wing 3 days after Doc cleared her for activity and had been there every Tuesday and Thursday since. Cole had spent the 3 months recovering from his leg fractures, a process he had approached with the impatience of a man constitutionally unsuited to inactivity. By October, he was walking without a crutch, still with a slight stiffness that his doctor said would resolve fully by winter. He drove from Flagstaff to Phoenix 3 or 4 times a week, overseeing the renovation meeting with the nonprofits board, doing the work of building something institutional from what had begun as a single desperate act. They were building something. Clara could feel it acquiring weight and substance the way a structure acquires it, not all at once, but incrementally each day, adding to something that was beginning to be capable of bearing load. She thought about this on a Tuesday morning in October while she was reviewing the intake protocols at her desk when her phone rang. The number was blocked. She looked at it for 1 full second before answering. In 3 months of building and planning and the ordinary operational complications of establishing a nonprofit organization, she had not received a blocked call. The FBI had called, Cole had called, Doc had called, contractors had called with numbers she did not recognize. None of them had been blocked. She answered. The voice was distorted, the same electronic filtering as before, genderless and ageless, and chosen for its effect. It said, Mrs. Whitmore. She said yes. It said, you have been busy. The center looks very promising. We have been following the progress with considerable interest. The temperature in Clara's chest dropped several degrees. She said, who is this? The voice said, someone who wants to have a brief and productive conversation about your future, specifically about whether you have one. She said nothing. She was already moving through what she knew and what she needed to know, and what the call was designed to make her do. The voice said, you cost us a significant amount of money and operational capacity this summer. Mrs. Whitmore, the people responsible for that loss are unhappy. They want compensation. Since financial compensation seems unlikely given your nonprofit status, they have settled on a different currency. She said, what do you want? The voice said. Close the center, cease all operations, leave Arizona within 30 days. If you do these things, the people you care about will be allowed to continue their lives uninterrupted. If you decline, we will begin making adjustments to that arrangement. She said, I would like to speak with Cassian Wolf directly. A pause. The pause was informative. It told her that either she was correct about who was behind this, or the person on the phone was not prepared for her to say that name, which amounted to the same thing. The voice said, you will speak with whoever contacts you. That is not a negotiation. She said, understood. The line went dead. Clara sat at her desk for 30 seconds. Then she called Cole. Doc was at the center that morning and he arrived at Clara's office within 4 minutes of her call, moving quickly for a man who had spent 3 days zip-tied to a chair 2 months prior. Cole arrived 20 minutes later, having driven from his place in North Flagstaff. Boone came with him. They sat in Clara's office and she played them the voicemail she had recorded during the call, a habit she had developed over 50 years of nursing in environments where documentation mattered. When it finished, Cole said, "Wolf." Clara said, "I believe so," or someone working directly for him. Doc said, "He lost his field operation. He lost his field manager. He lost the income from a network that had been running for years. He is not going to let that pass without response." Boone said, "We should have been ready for this." Clara said, "We should have been and we were not, and that is finished. The question is what we do now." Cole said, "We shut it down, temporarily. Move the staff somewhere safe, increase security at the ranch, and at Doc's place, let the FBI handle Wolf." Clara said, "We tried that approach in July. The FBI was 3 steps behind every time something moved. These people have resources and patience, and they are very good at not being where you look for them." She looked at each of them in turn. She said, "And we cannot shut down the center. We have 14 people in intake right now. We have referrals coming from 3 hospitals. We have staff who left other positions to be here. If we close even temporarily, those 14 people go back to whatever they came from." The room was quiet. Doc said, "So what are you proposing?" Clara said, "I am proposing that we stop waiting for Wolf to come to us on his terms." She paused. "We give him an invitation." 2 days after the phone call, Doc Reed was attacked outside his apartment building. He had stayed late at the center reviewing case files and had declined the offer of an escort because Harlan Reed was a man who had been declining offers of protection for 70 years on the principle that requiring protection was a form of defeat. He was walking from his car to his building entrance at 9:40 in the evening when 3 men stepped out of the shadows between the parked cars and hit him with the efficiency of people who had been instructed to hurt rather than to kill. He sustained 2 cracked ribs, a broken left wrist, and a black eye that closed completely. He was conscious throughout, which he later described as fortunate because it allowed him to form accurate impressions of his attackers, all 3 of whom moved with the specific trained economy of former military personnel. They left a note in his jacket pocket, plain paper block letters: "This is your last warning. Close the center. Leave Arizona." Clara arrived at the hospital at 10:15. She stood at Doc's bedside and looked at his damaged face and felt very clearly and without drama the arrival of a particular state of mind that she had not inhabited since her years in the Navy. It was not rage. Rage was imprecise, and imprecision was expensive. It was clarity. The specific lucid calm of a person who has removed all considerations except the one that matters. She said, "We are going to end this," Doc said through a jaw that was swelling. "I concur. Do you have a plan?" She said, "I am working on one." Cole was in the corridor outside. She stepped out and closed the door. He said, "I want to go after Wolf directly." She said, "I know. And that is exactly what he has designed his operation to survive. He is never on scene. He is never in the room. He sends other people. You go after the people he sends, and he replaces them, and nothing changes." Cole said then what Clara said, "We make him come to us. We make him believe he has won. And when he comes to confirm his victory in person, because men like Wolf always want to see it for themselves, we are ready." Cole looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You are talking about surrendering publicly." She said, "I am talking about appearing to surrender publicly. There is a significant difference." The press conference was held 4 days later on the front steps of the Henry Whitmore Center. Clara had spent 2 of those 4 days on the phone with FBI agent Delia Hargrove, who had worked the original Wolf investigation for 3 years before the Flagstaff case handed her the first concrete evidence she had. Hargrove was precise, serious, and honest about what the FBI could and could not do. She said, "If you can get him in a room and get him talking, we can use it." She said the wire we fit you with will capture everything within 20 feet at conversational volume. She said, Clara, if this goes wrong, we move in immediately. She said, I need you to understand what immediately means in a situation with armed subjects. Clara said, I spent 15 years in Navy medicine. I understand response times. Hargrove said, then we do this. On the day of the press conference, Clara stood at the podium on the front steps of the center she had spent 3 months building, and she looked at the cameras and the reporters and the small crowd of supporters who had gathered because word had spread, and she felt precisely and fully the weight of what she was about to do. She said, 3 months ago, my friends and I were fortunate enough to rescue 7 people from a terrible situation. We believed that by doing so, we had made our community safer. We were wrong about the scope of what we were dealing with. She paused. She let the cameras find her face. She said, since that rescue, the people I care about have been threatened, surveilled, and attacked. 2 nights ago, a 70-year-old doctor who has spent his life saving others was beaten outside his home because of his association with this center. I cannot in good conscience continue to expose the people around me to this level of danger. She looked directly into the nearest camera. She said, the Henry Whitmore Center will cease operations at the end of this week. I will be leaving Arizona within the month. I am deeply sorry to the people who are counting on us. I hope someone braver than I am will continue this work. She stepped back from the podium. She did not take questions. She walked back inside the building with Cole and Doc and Boone behind her, and she closed the door. The silence inside lasted about 4 seconds. Doc said, that was the most convincing thing I have ever watched you do. Clara said I was not entirely performing. Cole looked at her. He said, what do you mean? She said, I mean that part of me, a real part, is exhausted and frightened and would prefer a quiet ranch in the rest of whatever years I have left. She looked at him steadily. But that part does not get to make the decision. Because there are 14 people in this building right now who need what we built here. And there will be 100 more next month and 1,000 more after that. And Cassian Wolf does not get to take that from them. The press conference went viral within 6 hours. The coverage was extensive and, from Wolf's perspective, exactly what he would have wanted to see. National outlets picked up the story. Social media amplified it. The narrative was clear and legible. Elderly heroes intimidated into retreat by forces too powerful to resist. The message came 18 hours later. A text to Clara's phone from a number that resolved when Agent Hargrove ran it to a prepaid device purchased in Tucson 3 weeks prior. It said, smart choice, Desert Eagle Diner, Highway 89. Thursday, 2 p.m., come alone. We discuss terms of your departure. Clara showed it to Hargrove. Hargrove said that is him or someone who reports directly to him. The location choice is significant. Highway 89 is the road where your involvement began. He is sending a message. Clara said, I know what he is sending. Let him send it. Thursday morning. Clara woke at 5 o'clock and lay in the dark and listened to the desert and thought about Henry. She thought about a morning in 1987 aboard the USNS Comfort when she had worked 9 straight hours on 17 casualties and then gone to her bunk and lain in the dark and thought, I do not know if I have any more of this. And then got up the next morning and found out that she did. She thought about the way Henry had looked at her across 30 years of mornings and ordinary evenings and the occasional crisis that ordinary life produces, and the way that look had contained always a specific quality of confidence that was not blind and not unearned. He knew her. He had watched her in the situations that reveal character, and he had formed an accurate assessment, and that assessment was she could be counted on. She thought, I hope you were right, Henry. She got up and dressed and made coffee and sat on the front porch with the Colt on the table beside her and watched the sun come up over the red rocks of Sedona and thought about what today needed to be. At noon, Hargrove arrived at the ranch with 2 agents and the wire equipment. She fitted the device to Clara's torso with the professional efficiency of someone who had done this many times. She tested it twice, walked to the far end of the hallway, and spoke at a normal conversational volume, and the recording was clear. She said, the device has a 6-hour battery. The range is reliable up to 30 feet. We will have agents inside the diner as customers and in vehicles at both ends of the parking lot. Clara said Cole and Doc will be inside. Hargrove said that is not ideal. Clara said Cole has been waiting 3 months to be in the same room as the man who had his best friend beaten and his road mined. He is going to be inside the diner, or he is going to be outside it without authorization. And outside without authorization is more dangerous for everyone. Hargrove looked at her. She said, fine. Cole and Doc inside, positioned away from your table, visible to you, but not to anyone entering. Boone in the parking lot in a vehicle. Clara said, agreed. She said, Clara, if Wolf brings armed security and the situation inside that diner can become very dangerous very quickly. Clara said, I know. Hargrove said, you do not have to do this. Clara thought about Doc's face in the hospital room. She thought about 14 people in the intake wing of a center that was not going to close. She thought about Helen Martian, who had arrived at her ranch with a casserole and stayed in Frank Burgess and his grandchildren, and Sarah Tolliver, who had gone back to nursing because it was the thing she was built for. She said, yes, I do, at 1:45. Clara parked the Bronco in the lot of the Desert Eagle Diner and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. The diner was a classic roadside structure, faded paint, a neon sign that advertised coffee and pie, the kind of place that had been serving the same menu to highway travelers for 40 years without apology. She had been here before. Henry had liked their pie. She checked the Colt. She smoothed her shirt over the wire. She got out of the truck. The diner was half full, truckers at the counter, a couple in a window booth, a man and woman at a table near the middle who were Agent Hargrove's people, though they read entirely as ordinary customers. Cole was in a corner booth with a newspaper and a cup of coffee, and his posture said, man killing time on a road trip. Doc was at the counter, 2 stools from the end, talking to the waitress about something that was making her laugh, which was exactly right because it was exactly natural. At the corner table in the back, positioned with his back to the wall and clear sight lines to both the entrance and the kitchen, sat a man. He was in his early 50s. The suit was expensive and fit him with the precision of custom work. His hair was iron gray and cut with military brevity. He had the kind of face that had been handsome once and had since been refined by time into something harder and more specific. His eyes were already on the door when she walked through it, and they assessed her in one continuous motion, from entrance to arrival at his table, the way trained people assess without appearing to assess. He said, Mrs. Whitmore, please sit down. She sat. He said, I appreciate your punctuality. She said, I appreciate you making the time. He studied her face. He said, you are calmer than I expected. She said, should I not be? He said, most people who sit across from me in situations like this are frightened. She said, I have sat across from frightened people my whole life. Doctors, patients, soldiers. Fear is a condition. It does not have to be a direction. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not much, just a small recalibration. He said, I will be direct. You announced the closure of your center and your departure from Arizona. I am here to confirm the terms of that agreement and to ensure you understand what continuation of your activities would mean. She said, and what would it mean? He said, it would mean that the people around you experience consequences that I would prefer to avoid, but am entirely prepared to implement. He folded his hands on the table. I want to be clear that this is not a preference. It is a statement of capability and intent. She said, and if I comply, if I close the center and leave, he said, then we have no further business. You return to whatever retired life suits you, and this conversation becomes the last one we ever have. Clara looked at him steadily. She let a moment pass, then as she said, can I ask you something? He said, go ahead. She said, what does a man like you tell himself about the people in those trucks? About the elderly individuals you move from one place to another like inventory? What is the internal narrative that makes that livable Cassian Wolf looked at her for a moment? She watched something move in his face, the specific consideration of a man deciding how much of himself to reveal, and watched him arrive at the conclusion that she had been hoping he would arrive at, that she was no threat, that this conversation was already won, that a little candor was the prerogative of the victorious. He said the people we work with are already beyond the reach of any system that was going to help them. Homeless, isolated, forgotten. No family, no resources, no future.
It hurts.
We
so
provide a
much.
function that the market
I
demands.
know, dear.
The medical
Just
community
breathe.
is short on
Thank
transplantable organs. We address that
You
shortage.
have no
The narrative,
right
as you call
to
it,
be
is supply
here.
and demand. She said, and the 7
This
people
is
from the
my
mining
diner.
complex. Doc
Get
Reed,
out.
he said, complications. Dr.
Thank
Reed saw
you,
something
thank
he
you
should not
all
have.
so much.
The operation
Your
has been
support
adapted to
means
prevent
the world
similar
to us.
complications going forward.
Together.
She said adapted. That is an interesting word for what happened to those people. He said, Mrs. Whitmore, I did not come here for a moral debate. I came to confirm an agreement. She said, and I came to confirm something else. His expression sharpened. She watched it happen, watched the recalibration move faster this time, watched him understand that something in the structure of this conversation was not what he had designed. He reached under the table. Clara was faster. The Colt came up from her hip in one continuous motion, the motion Henry had drilled into her on a range outside Sedona over 100 afternoons, until it was not a decision but a reflex. She pressed the barrel against his ribs, through the table's edge, below the sight line of the room, hidden from everyone except him. She said very quietly, at this range, the suit will not help you. Wolf went completely still. She said, the conversation we just had is recorded. Every word. She held his gaze. The agents in this room are federal. There are vehicles at both ends of the parking lot. Your security team outside is already being addressed. From the parking lot, she could hear it, the specific controlled commotion of a situation being managed by people who were very good at managing situations. One sharp sound, then another, then voices giving instructions in the flat, decisive tones of authority. Wolf's expression moved through several things very quickly. She watched calculation work in his face, the rapid assessment of remaining options, the narrowing of paths, the arrival at something that looked for just a moment like the specific anger of a man who has never before encountered the closed door. He said, you are a 73-year-old woman. She said, I am. And you were so certain that was a limitation. He reached for the gun under the table. She pressed the Colt harder into his ribs. He stopped. She said, do not. Behind her, she heard Cole stand from his corner booth. She heard Doc put his coffee cup down with a deliberate care that was its own kind of statement. She heard the agents in the middle of the room move from their table. Agent Hargrove came through the door with 2 agents behind her. Her badge visible, her voice calm and carrying federal agents. Everyone stay seated. Cassian Wolf, you are under arrest. Wolf looked at Clara across the inches between them. His expression had settled into something she recognized from a lifetime of working with people in extremity. It was the expression of a man arriving at a truth he had successfully avoided for a very long time. He said, there are others. This operation is larger than me. You have not ended anything. Clara said, then you will have a great deal of time to help us find them. She stood back from the table as Hargrove's agents moved in. She kept the Colt at her side, pointed down, safety on. Her hands were completely steady. Cole appeared at her shoulder. He stood beside her, and they watched Cassian Wolf stand and be handcuffed and be walked toward the door, and Cole said nothing, which was exactly the right response. Doc appeared on her other side. He was wearing his arm in a sling, and his eye was still partly closed, and he looked at Wolf being walked past with the expression of a man who has decided that the sight of justice being administered is sufficient and that anything further would be redundant. Outside in the parking lot, 4 of Wolf's security team were on the ground with agents moving efficiently around them. Boone was leaning against his truck with his arms crossed, watching the process with the satisfaction of a man who has waited a long time for a particular outcome. He caught Clara's eye and gave her a single nod. She nodded back. 6 weeks later, Hargrove called with the news that Clara had been expecting and had not let herself anticipate too directly because anticipation of good things was a form of vulnerability she had learned not to indulge. Hargrove said, "The recording was admitted without challenge. Wolf's attorneys attempted to argue coercion, and the judge took 40 minutes to dismiss the argument. She said he is looking at federal trafficking charges, conspiracy assault, and a list of associated charges that the assistant U.S. attorney described as comprehensive. She said the information extracted from his organization has identified operations in 4 additional states. 17 arrests to date with more expected. She said Clara, the trafficking network Wolf ran, had been operating for 7 years. The victim count is still being assessed, but we are looking at over 300 individuals." Clara sat in her office at the center with the phone against her ear and the morning sun coming through the window that looked out onto the street where people walked, and the city continued its ordinary business of being a city. She said, "Thank you, Delia." Hargrove said, "Thank yourself and your friends." After the call, Clara sat at her desk for a while. She did not cry, which surprised her slightly. She had expected to feel something that required that kind of release. What she felt instead was quieter and more durable. The feeling of something completed. Not ended. Completion and ending were different things, but brought to a point where the next part could begin. She got up and walked through the center. In the medical wing, Doc was examining a new patient with the careful attention he brought to every examination, asking questions and listening to the answers with the full presence of someone who understood that being heard was sometimes its own form of medicine. He looked up when Clara passed the doorway and gave her the small nod that had come to mean, between them, things are as they should be. She returned it and kept walking. In the administrative office, Helen Marchand was on the phone with a hospital liaison, her voice precise and warm simultaneously, a combination that was apparently a skill we had developed over 30 years of managing 8th graders and had discovered translated perfectly to managing intake coordinators and referral networks. She did not look up when Clara passed. She was working. In the security station near the entrance, Frank Burgess was talking with a young man who had come to them through a veteran's referral, recently returned from overseas, recently uncertain about most things. Frank was talking to him with the easy, unhurried patience of a man who understood that some things had to be said more than once before they were heard. The young man was listening. Sarah Tolliver was in the supply room, cataloging a delivery of medical supplies with the methodical satisfaction of a nurse who has spent her career wishing for adequate supplies and has finally in her retirement been given some. Clara walked through all of it and out the back door to the small courtyard that the renovation had created from what had been a loading dock. Someone had put chairs out there, folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, and someone else had put a potted plant in the corner that was doing better than anyone had expected, given the sun exposure and the irregular watering. She sat in one of the chairs. The October sun in Phoenix had begun its annual negotiation towards something bearable, the brutal arithmetic of summer finally giving ground. The air in the courtyard was warm, but not punishing. Somewhere beyond the wall, the city moved through its morning. She thought about Henry. She thought about the ranch and the red rocks of Sedona, and the 45 years of a life that had been worth every hour of it. She thought about what it had cost and what it had given, and how those two things, the cost and the gift, were not separate ledgers, but the same one. She thought about a morning on Highway 89, a hand moving in the gravel, under a pile of rocks, in the 2 seconds she had spent deciding whether to stop. She did not regret the 2 seconds. The 2 seconds were necessary. The choice had to be made consciously, or it did not mean what it meant. If she had simply stopped without the 2 seconds, it would have been reflex, and reflex was not the same as character. She had made the choice. She had chosen to be the person Henry believed she was. Cole arrived at the center at noon. He brought sandwiches from a place near his apartment in Flagstaff that he had recently discovered and had been describing to Clara and Doc with evangelical enthusiasm for 3 weeks. He set them on the table in Clara's office and said, "Hargrove called me." She said, "I know." He said 17 arrests. She said, "So far." He looked at her across the desk. His leg had healed fully over the 3 months. The stiffness his doctor had predicted mostly resolved, and he moved now with the unhurried confidence of a man who has been through a hard thing and come out the other side with a clearer sense of what matters. He said, "When I was under those rocks on Highway 89, I had already stopped expecting anyone to stop. I had been there long enough to have done the math. The math said no one stops for Iron Cross. She said the math was wrong. He said the math was wrong because you do not do math when you make those decisions. You do something else." She said Henry called it character. He thought it was the only thing that mattered in the end. Cole said he sounds like Doc. She said they would have liked each other. He pushed a sandwich across the desk toward her. He said, "There is something I want to talk to you about." She said, "All right." He said, "The Marine Veterans Association has been in contact. They want to partner with us on a national expansion. Texas, California, Nevada centers modeled on this one, serving the same population we serve here. They have funding, they have organizational infrastructure. They need what we have built here as a template." She looked at him. He said it would be significant work, more than what we are doing now. It would require you to be more than a local operations director. It would make you effectively the architect of something national. She said, "Cole." He said, "I know you are 73. She said, "I was going to say yes." He stopped. He said, "You were..." She said, "I have been waiting for you to propose something like this for 3 weeks. I could see it coming." He laughed. It was the genuine kind, the kind that cost something, and it suited his face. She said, "Tell the Marine Veterans Association we will meet with them next month. Tell them to bring their full proposal and their organizational structure and any questions they have about the model, and tell them to clear the afternoon because we are thorough." Cole said, "I will tell them exactly that." They ate their sandwiches at the desk with the afternoon light coming through the window and the sound of the center operating around them. The ordinary sounds of a place doing the work. It was built for voices and footsteps and the low continuous activity of people being helped by people who had chosen to help them. After a while, Doc came in and took the third sandwich without asking and sat in the other chair, and they were quiet together. In the easy way they had become quiet together over the months, 3 people who had arrived at the kind of understanding that does not require maintenance. Doc said, "I heard from one of the original 7 today." Margaret Pruitt, Clara said, "How is she?" Doc said, "Good. Better than good," she said. "She has been volunteering at a senior center in Scottsdale. She said she went in to help and discovered she was actually quite good at it. She said she wanted me to tell you something." Clara said what Doc said. She said, "Tell Clara that she was right. That age is just experience you have not used yet." Clara looked at the window. Outside, the city continued. The sun was past its peak and beginning its afternoon descent, and the light had shifted to the particular gold of a Phoenix October, the color of something that has endured the summer and come through it. She thought, yes, that is exactly right. The day of the opening ceremony came on a Saturday in late October, the Arizona sky a brilliant clear blue, and the air finally carrying the first genuine hint of the cooler season ahead. Over 300 people attended. The 7 originally rescued hostages were there, most of them with family members, who stood close and held their hands or their arms with the specific attentiveness of people who had been told what almost happened and had not entirely finished processing it. The 60 people freed during the investigation of Wolf's network were there in smaller numbers, some of them still fragile, still in the early stages of rebuilding, but present. Donors, volunteers, media, local politicians, representatives from the partnering hospitals. And in the back, standing in a loose group with a particular quality of men who are comfortable at the edges of official gatherings, Boone Taggart and a dozen members of the Iron Cross MC, all of them in their vests, all of them applauding. Frank Burgess had organized the chairs in the main hall with the precision of a man who had run formations for 20 years. Helen Marchand had prepared a program and distributed it with the efficient warmth of someone who understood that the small ceremonies mattered as much as the large ones. Sarah Tolliver had set up a medical station in the corner in case anyone needed it, because that was who Sarah Tolliver was. Cole spoke first. He stood at the podium in a jacket that he wore with the slight discomfort of a man more accustomed to leather, and he looked out at the assembled crowd and said, "3 months ago, we were just 3 people trying to do the right thing. Now look at this." He gestured to the building. The crowd, the future. This center represents something bigger than any of us. It represents the decision that every person in this room made to not drive past. Doc spoke next. He stood at the podium with his arm no longer in a sling but still held slightly carefully, the way a healed bone is held for a while after the cast comes off, and he said, "When I was held captive, I thought my life was over. But Clara and Cole did not give up on me. They fought for me when I could not fight for myself, and that taught me something I thought I already knew and had apparently forgotten. We are stronger together than we ever could be alone." Then it was Clara's turn. She stood at the podium and looked out at the faces, so many of them familiar now. She looked at Helen in the front row, who had arrived at her ranch with a casserole and had never left. She looked at Frank, whose grandchildren were in the second row with a sign they had made that said in large crayon letters, "Our grandpa's hero helped save people." She looked at Sarah, who was standing near the wall with her arms crossed and her expression saying, "I am not going to cry," which meant she was about to cry. She saw Margaret Pruitt in the third row, the woman whose sister had called to say thank you, sitting with a small smile that said, "I told you so." She thought about Henry. She thought about what he would say if he could see this. She thought he would probably say something simple. He had always preferred simple things. She thought he would say, "I told you so." Clara spoke, and her voice carried across the assembled crowd without effort, because 50 years of speaking in rooms where what you said determined whether people lived or died had given her a voice that did not require amplification. She said, "My husband Henry believed that every life has value, that age does not diminish worth, that we are all responsible for taking care of each other. Not because it is required, because it is right." She paused. She said, "For 6 years after he died, I forgot that. I stopped living. I went through the motions. I woke up each morning and went through the hours and went back to sleep and could not have told you at the end of any of those days what any of it had been for." She looked at Cole, then at Doc. She said, "These 2 men reminded me what it means to fight for something, to stand up when it is easier to sit down, to help when it is safer to walk away. Not because they told me those things, because they showed me by doing them that they were still possible." Her voice strengthened. She said, "This center is named after Henry because he believed in it before it existed. He believed in a world where the vulnerable are protected and the forgotten are seen and the elderly are valued rather than discarded. He believed that one person could not change the world, but one person could change someone's world. And if enough people do that, eventually the whole world changes." She let the silence hold for a moment. She said, "I am 73 years old. People have been telling me to slow down and take it easy and act my age for the past year. I want to tell you what I have learned about that. Acting my age means bringing 73 years of experience, skill, discipline, and the particular clarity that comes from having lost enough to know what matters to bear on problems that matter. It means not wasting what I know. It means not stepping aside because the calendar says I should." She looked out at the crowd. She said, "This center is our promise. We will not look away. We will not drive past. We will not decide that someone else's problem is not ours because they are old or forgotten or inconvenient. This is the promise, and we are just getting started." The room rose to its feet. Clara stood at the podium for a moment and let the sound settle over her, and thought about the morning on Highway 89, and the hand in the gravel, and the 2 seconds, and the choice, and she thought, yes, this is what those 2 seconds were for. She stepped back from the podium afterward As people moved through the center and the energy of the crowd shifted from ceremony to the particular warmth of people finding each other and talking and beginning the ordinary work of connection, Clara found a quiet moment near the back wall. She pulled out her phone and opened the photograph she had taken of her and Henry's wedding picture, the one she kept on the shelf above the kitchen window. She looked at it for a long moment. She said quietly to the image, "We did it, Henry. We built something that matters. I hope you are proud." She put the phone away. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to find Cole and Doc standing behind her with the specific expression of men who have been watching from nearby and decided that the moment had run its course and it was time to rejoin the world. Cole said, "You okay?" She said, "Better than okay." Doc said, "Margaret Pruitt wants to volunteer here starting next month. She called me this morning. She said she has decided that sitting at home waiting to matter is not a retirement strategy she is willing to continue." Clara smiled. She said, "Tell her Tuesday and Thursday. We will find her something useful." Doc said, "I already did." They stood together for a moment watching the room. The 14 people currently in intake were visible in clusters, some with family, some with the staff, some simply standing in the space and looking at it as if they were still in the process of believing it was real. The volunteers moved among them with the practiced ease of people who had found the thing they were for. The whole room hummed with the low continuous frequency of purposeful work. Doc said, "You know what I realized today?" Claire said. "What he said 6 months ago, I was alone in a trailer, wondering if my life still had meaning. Now I am here a part of something that is going to outlast all of us." He looked at Clara. "You gave me that, you and Cole both." Clara said, "We gave each other that, of each other. That is what family does." Cole said, "Family, not the one you are born into." Doc said, "The one you build." Clara said, "The one worth fighting for." They stood in comfortable silence, watching their creation come to life around them. That evening, Clara drove home on Highway 89 as the last light left the sky. She had driven this road every day for 30 years in the dark and in the heat and in the occasional winter rain that surprised the desert with its brief insistence. She knew it by heart, which was the right way to know a road by the organ that mattered most. She came to the place. She knew it precisely, the specific quarter mile where the cliff face rose on the eastern side and the guardrail followed the shoulder. The gravel was a particular color where it caught the headlights. She had driven past it every day for 3 months and had not stopped. Tonight, she pulled the Bronco onto the shoulder and got out. The night air was cool and very clear. The stars were doing what Arizona stars did, which was to make every other consideration feel appropriately sized. She stood at the shoulder where she had parked on a July morning and looked at the base of the cliff where the rocks had been and where now there was nothing, just the ordinary ground, as if nothing had happened here at all. She thought one decision, one moment of not driving past, and from that moment, this. She stood there for a while and let the evening settle around her and thought about Henry with the specific quality of missing him that had changed over 3 months from a wound into something more like a companion, something she carried that did not weigh her down, but did not leave her either. She said quietly to the night in the stars and the particular stretch of desert that had been the beginning of all of it, "I found it, Henry. The reason to wake up tomorrow." She got back in the Bronco. The radio came on with the engine the way it always did, tuned to the country station out of Flagstaff. Willie Nelson was singing about being on the road again, about the life he loved, about moving and making music with his friends, the same song that had been playing on a July morning when everything was still ordinary and the road ahead was just a road. Clara Whitmore, 73 years old, former Navy nurse widow, director of the Henry Whitmore Center for Trafficking Survivors, architect of a national expansion that would bear her husband's name across 5 states, put the Bronco in drive and pulled back onto Highway 89. And she sang along. For the first time in 6 years, she sang along. The road stretched ahead of her, long and certain, and lit by her own headlights, the same road it had always been going somewhere she had not yet been, which was the only kind of road worth driving. She pressed down on the gas. There was work left to do, and she was exactly the right person to do it. And she knew that now, with the kind of certainty that does not require maintenance or reassurance or the approval of anyone who had told her to slow down and take it easy and act her age. She knew it the way she knew this road, by heart.